So this is our C# script. If we look into it, we already have a couple of things already sitting in here. This stuff, all up here, tells us that we are using certain functions that are available to us that will help make our program more complete so we can interface with other things. One of the things you'll see right here is that we are using Unity Engine. So this tells our C# editor in Visual Studio that the code that we're using is going to interface and start using components that are available in the Unity engine. So right here we have a public class. So a class is basically just a container. It tells us that all the code that does this kind of stuff that we're trying to do right now is all held inside this one container, this one box. And we call that box a class. If we have a class in this case to control a player, the player controller class, that means all of the code inside this box is all going to be relative to controlling our player. It would be weird to have our enemy controller script also live inside here. And it's just basically a way to organize all the script so that we know where everything lives and we can have kind of one nice little contained place where we know where to look for our code and our functions. Inside, we have two methods or functions. One is start, and if we see right here, this says that start is called before the first frame update. So this will happen before anyone sees anything on the screen. These two little dashes here say that everything after these dashes is a comment. So it's something just meant for humans to read. The program itself should completely ignore this. So if we ever have anything that we want to type in just to give ourselves a note, or if we have a code that we're not sure is working and we don't want the program to run that code, commenting it like this is how we do that. If I wanted to add a new comment, I would simply type in 2 slashes and then there's a comment. And then the compiler, the program will completely ignore everything after that. But it has to be on the same line. If I took away those dashes, see how it's now starting to give us all sorts of weird errors and red lines and stuff like that? It's because this line has not been commented out. I would have to add 2 dashes to it in order to make this comment here so that the compiler and the program ignores it. So this method start is where we put anything that we want to run to kind of set up our game before the frame is even rendered. And down here we have the update method. The update method is updated once per frame, which means every single time something new is drawn on the screen, it is going to run all of the code inside this update. It loops over and over and over and over again so that our game can keep moving forward. A thing that you might put in here is if you wanted a player to move forward every time you pressed the W key, then in here you'd put in the logic that would check to see if the W key has been pressed, and if so, move it forward. And that would update and run that code every single time a frame is re-rendered, which can happen anywhere from 10 to 60 to 90 times a second. So this gets run a lot. Notice that our methods here have these little curly brackets right after it. One open, one to close. All of the code that is inside the start method needs to sit in between these two brackets. If I put some code here, because it's not inside my start bracket, this code will cause an error. So I'd have to erase that and put in the code here if I wanted to. Example might be a variable to hold an integer. The number 1 might go here. If I put this code down here, then it would cause all sorts of issues and it wouldn't run. Same thing is true for the update. Anything that I want to run within the update loop that happens 10 to 90 times a second, I would need to put the code inside here. Anything that is outside of these methods, outside of the brackets, maybe up here, as long as it's still inside the class, can be available to all of the things inside here, every method. So if I had an integer variable, which is just a number, named hi, I set that equal to 1, only inside this method could I see hi, the variable. So I could type in hi and see, it sees it. It says it's a local variable of type integer. If I went into the update method and typed in hi, see, it doesn't exist here. It can't see anything outside of these brackets. If, however, I put this variable up here in the class, then I can see it in any of the methods or functions underneath that are contained inside this class. So I can see it here. And I could also see it here. So now that we have a basic understanding of how our code works and how to add and pass variables, we have one more step that we have to get to with our variables to be able to make some changes to our game. And that is how to reference an object that is inside our game, our Unity engine. And in this case, we really want to modify the player, our little green guy here. So with this player, he is an entity or an object that exists within our Unity game, but our code doesn't really have a way to see him at the moment. So what we have to do is create a variable that can be accessed both in the editor as well as in Unity. And in this case, what that is called is a public variable. So we're going to add this public variable up here underneath the class, but not in any of the functions. The reason why is because I want to be able to access this variable, our player, from all of these different functions here, start and update, and anything else that we happen to add a little bit later. So it's a public, but what type of variable does it need to be? What type of information are we going to be editing about our player? If we go back here, the thing that allows us to add physics to our player is the rigid body. So within rigid body, we can add mass, drag, we can add forces, constrain forces, all sorts of stuff. So the part of our player that we want to modify is the rigid body component of our player. So what we'll do is we'll go back into our script and we'll say we want a variable of type rigid body, and then we'll name them player. From here, I can go in here into my start, see my variable, and then inside here have access to all of the functions and methods that are attached to a rigid body object. So I can add force, delete force, add gravity, remove gravity, all sorts of things like that. So now that we have a variable in our code that is public, so able to be accessed outside of just this code, and is named player, we know what it needs to be. Now we have to reference that variable also in the Unity editor. So if we go into Unity, if I drag my script over here and just plop it right in, you'll see that it has a rigid body variable named player. And that's where we can add the rigid body that we wish to reference in the variable player. If you're having trouble, by the way, clicking and dragging the script over, if you want, you can just hit the add component and then type in the name of the script, and it should show up, have a little C# next to it, clicky there, and then it's added. So the variable player needs a rigid body to be able to access, so we know that's our player cube, so we're just going to go over, clicky on this guy, and they'll give us all the rigid bodies inside our scene. So we want player cube, double clicky there, and that's added. So now our variable player inside our script is linked to our actual player right there. The reason why we want our script to live within the player object is because it has to control the player. So usually you'll have these scripts live inside the object that it is most likely to interact with. But just because it's living inside the inspector of the player object doesn't mean that this variable automatically knows who it's supposed to be referencing. So that's why we have to do that extra step of going into this variable and selecting which object we're talking about and which one we want to reference. So from there, we can go back in here, and then any code that we type that references player, all of the commands that we give it will directly affect this player.